And this morning, when you said that space and time disappear in awareness, it's easier for me to look at time than it is at space. So I started reflecting on that. And all of a sudden things got like infinitesimally small, like they turned into this tiny pinpoint and kept getting smaller and smaller, and then it exploded. Here and there are the same thing. So all the opposites are the unity. It's just one thing.
But I'm going to go back to something you said, which was beautiful about this point, because if pure consciousness itself has no form, and something with no form can have no dimension. So consciousness itself is not a space, although it is sometimes referred to as space. It is literally dimensionless. Well, if we had to represent this dimensionless presence of consciousness, the only way we could do it would be an infinitesimally small point. It's not even a point, because even a point has some dimension, but in order to enable us to think of it or imagine it, let's consider consciousness a point of zero dimension. That is, remember, I'm not talking about some abstract consciousness. I'm talking about the very nature of the consciousness with which each of us is now experiencing our experience. It has no form, and something without form has no dimension. So I'm just talking about this ordinary consciousness. So given that everything we experience appears in consciousness and is made of consciousness, how can this four-dimensional experience of time and space be made out of something that has no dimensions? And there's this beautiful phrase which we find in both the Tantric tradition, both the Vedantic tradition and the Tantric tradition. Ramana Maharshi expressed it like this. He said, "The I thought is the mother of the world." Now, by the I thought, he didn't literally mean the thought I, because infants don't think I, but they experience the world. Dogs and cats don't think I, but they experience the world. So he obviously didn't mean literally the concept I, create, is the mother of the world. What he meant is the localization of infinite consciousness, or the apparent localization of infinite consciousness in the form of the finite mind, is the activity through which dimensionless consciousness knows itself as a four-dimensional universe. And the Tantric tradition, they say exactly the same thing. The world is an expansion of I. In other words, it is only when consciousness localizes itself in the form of each of our minds, this is the I, that it knows itself, that expands into four dimensions, that it knows itself as a four-dimensional universe. In other words, the I thought, the localization of consciousness, is the portal through which eternity passes into time. And the same portal through which time passes in the opposite direction into eternity.
It felt like a portal. And when I opened my eyes, it was like something was floating in manifestation in a way. And
it's like title of one of Krishnamurti's book, The First and Last Freedom. That this portal, I, when consciousness passes through it in one direction, it loses its freedom and seems to become a separate self. Through the agency of the separate self or the finite mind, it knows itself as the world. When it passes, so that is its last freedom. It gives up its freedom. But when it passes through the same portal in the opposite direction, that it gains its freedom. It reclaims its innate freedom. It is its first freedom. So the same portal, I, is both the last freedom and the first freedom. It's like the door when you've been convicted and you go to jail. You pass through a door in one direction, you lose your freedom. When you leave jail, you pass through the same door in the opposite direction and reclaim your freedom. It's the same door. On one side it says captivity. On the same door on the other side it says freedom. So the I thought is the first and last freedom. The gateway through which eternity passes into time. same gateway through which time passes into eternity.
My understanding so far has been that, or is, that this mind and this body is sort of like a frequency within the one consciousness. It's a frequency, it's a movement, like you say, within consciousness. So consciousness knows and talks to itself through the filter of this limitation and gets the answer through your filter.
Yeah.
So far,
yeah.
It's okay. Yeah. Now, the confusion comes in, or what I'd like to clarify. We will probably agree that if there were a dog, the same thing would apply. It's a different filter, noticing different things, but essentially it's a different frequency. It's maybe moving a little bit faster or slower. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So from my understanding is that, for example, the glass of water that you have is also whatever frequency it may be, it is something, not a thing, but you know what I mean? It's a movement within consciousness that, even though it may not, it's like a one-directional thing from my understanding. It does not perceive me as far as this limitation knows, but I perceive it.
Yeah.
What I'm saying now, my understanding is basically the observer and the observed require each other. They're both necessary. There's no such thing as an observer without the observed and vice versa.
Okay.
Looking at reality, depending on the filter, it sees something according to its coloring maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
So is insentient or whatever, is this also a movement without the sensing?
Yes.
Yes.
An insentient, let's go to the analogy of the dream, because it explains this. At night, you fall asleep at night, and you dream a dreamed world. All there is to the dreamed world is the activity of your mind, which in this analogy represents consciousness, an activity of your conscious mind. Your conscious mind does not view the dreamed world directly. It localizes itself, or you could say a part of the activity of your mind dissociates from all the other part and localizes itself as a separate subject of experience, from whose perspective the activity of your mind appears as an outside world, inanimate, insentient objects. And that is true from the perspective of the dreamed character, the separate subject of experience. When you wake up in the morning, you realize the whole thing was the activity of your mind, but the activity of your mind appeared to be an insentient world, a multiplicity and diversity of objects, from the perspective of a localized subject. The dream character doesn't create the observed world. The reality of the dreamer's mind appears as the observed world from the perspective of the observer. The observer makes the dreamer's mind appear as a world.
That part, okay, I'm with you completely on that part. Maybe let's dig one level deeper, because, you know, like you sometimes say, there's a shared reality. So, for example, if that dream character, if I were to fall asleep right now, I cannot tell from my own experience that there is such a thing as Buckland Hall. I'm on the beach.
That's true.
But I also know.
But it's a reasonable inference.
That's exactly. I know this doesn't disappear for you, for all of the other contractions.
Yes. So it's reason. Although you cannot prove the existence of any other mind, you only know the contents of your own mind. It is reasonable for you to infer that there are other minds, and that if your mind were to fall asleep, Buckland Hall would still be observed by all of our minds.
Which is a fair inference, because...
Which is a reasonable inference, because all you're not inferring a whole new category of experience that you have never experienced. You're only inferring that there may be more minds like the mind that you experience.
Yes.
It's a very small inference. It is an inference, but it's a reasonable one. Whereas the matter model infers that there is a whole world outside consciousness. Now, if half a dozen people had experienced a world outside consciousness, then it would be reasonable to infer that there may be other instances of such a world. But nobody has ever experienced a world outside consciousness. Therefore, the inference that there is a world outside consciousness made of matter is of a completely different order of inference than the inference that there may be other minds apart from our own.
If we all walked out of this room, or let's say your bathroom, I think I heard Francis say that once. He said, when you walk into your bathroom in the morning, in that moment the toothbrush comes into existence, into an apparent existence.
No, nothing ever comes in. I'm not contradicting Francis here, but because he probably used the words in a different way, or it was a response to a different question. So I don't mean to contradict Francis, but nothing ever comes in or out of existence. The only thing there is consciousness, and consciousness is eternal. That's it. Nothing other than consciousness ever comes into existence or goes out of existence. There is just consciousness colouring itself with its own activity and then ceasing to colour itself. But even when it's colouring itself, nothing other than itself ever comes into existence. However, when you walk into the bathroom, this vibration of consciousness appears from the perspective of you, the observer, as the toothbrush. So the toothbrush doesn't come into existence then. Reality simply appears as a toothbrush when you observe it. But the reality of the toothbrush was there before you observed it, but it didn't look like a toothbrush. It was just pure consciousness vibrating.
Now we're honing in. So
it was your observation created the appearance of the toothbrush. In other words, the appearance of the appearance of the observed is closely connected with the observer. But the reality of the observed is not created by the observation. The reality of the observed is there underneath, before the rise of the observer and the observed, and it's there after the subsidence of the observer and the observed.
So let's call it not existence. I understood Francis, like you just explained, as there's no such thing as a toothbrush if there's nothing that labels it as such. But let's call it vibration that I observe and label it toothbrush. Is that vibration happening if I walk out of the bathroom?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. There's nothing to suggest that in other words, that consciousness can be vibrating within itself, and that vibration, when in this field of vibrating consciousness, when an observer is precipitated within this vibrating field, when an observer is localized in this vibrating field, the unlocalized aspect of this vibrating consciousness appears as the world.
Okay, so in a sense, being infinite, there are all sorts of possible frequencies which can be observed by infinite observers, and it may appear as infinite objects or whatever, but...
Well, the observed will always appear in correspondence with the nature of the observer. I mean, you know that from your own experience. When you have a couple of glasses of wine, the nature of the observer's mind changes, the nature of the observed changes. If there was a dog sitting in this room, the nature of the dog's mind is different from the nature of your mind, and the dog would see the same reality, the same vibration of consciousness, as a different kind of world. It would be seeing the same reality, but the way that reality appeared to it would depend upon the conditioning of its mind.
In this morning's contemplation, I was struck by the strong sense that even though there were sounds and sights and etc., that nothing was happening. nothing was happening, and that the mind therefore made the assumption that, well, nothing has ever happened. There wasn't a struggle with that, of course. It was the absence of struggle, in fact. But that was the sense. The mind translated this as that. Nothing was happening. Nothing has ever happened. And, prior to that, you speak of a model. Is it of, say, the screen, and then the movie is switched on, and there is an apparent activity, even though it's all made of the screen? Is it appropriate at some point to sort of allow perhaps the duality, if you like, of the activity and non-activity to collapse? And if so, well, what the heck is happening then?
Okay.
Right. Nothing.
So the answer to or the response to your first question is the suggestion that everything is the activity of consciousness, a suggestion that is made from the perspective of the separate self. No, I would say not, because there is something now. There is not, in your experience now, whatever all of this is, and we can't be sure what it is that you are experiencing, but whatever you are experiencing, it's not nothing. We can't be sure, for instance, that this is an outside world.
It's not nothing, but the sense was that nothing was happening.
Yeah, but
there was something there, but it wasn't.
There is something happening now. Yeah? There is experiencing. And experiencing has a color, a form, a shape, a flavor to it. There is something happening which we call the world. There is the activity of seeing, the activity of hearing. There's not a blank, empty void in your experience now. Yeah, so there is. Let's just say there is something, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And if we rely only on the evidence of experience, all we can say for sure is that there is consciousness, and whatever is happening is the activity of that consciousness. So now to go to your next question, this intuition you have that nothing ever happens or nothing has ever happened, that there is also some truth in that intuition, which doesn't contradict what I said in response to your first question. And a way to understand it would be this. When you have a dream, you fall asleep at night, you dream that you take a trip to the Far East, you have an adventure there, it lasts 3 months, you fly home, you walk in through the front door of your home. As you walk in through the door of your front home, you wake up. Mm-hmm. Right. And did anything that take place in your dream, the 3 months tour around the Far East, did anything happen in your waking state? Did any of that take place in your waking state? No, nothing happened in your waking state to do with your trip on the Far East. It took place in a different, so from the point of view of the waking state, nothing took place in that state. Sure. So in this analogy, the waking state is the equivalent of consciousness, and the dream state would be the equivalent of your current waking state. Nothing ever happens for the dreamer's mind. In that sense, we can interpret these sayings that we sometimes hear in the tradition, nothing ever happens.
Sure. Okay, that definitely helps. It'll take a bit of processing.
I had a surgery on my small surgery recently, and on my knee, and some of you from America have heard this story, because I think I told it at Garrison or the Mercy Center. So it was about a month ago. I was on the hospital trolley or bed in the anaesthetist's room just before the operating theatre. And the anaesthetist here was, and his assistant were here, and they were chatting with me, making it sound as if they were, really interested in what I did, and of course, they have this conversation with everyone. So they ask me the question that I always dread: what do you do? And so I make what I do sound as socially acceptable as possible, and I say something like, "Oh, I write books about philosophy and meditation," and "Oh, that's very interesting, do you?" And so we got talking like that. Anyway, so I thought, okay, come on, let's bring this conversation to an end. You don't have to do this with me; it's okay. And so I shut my eyes, sending a subliminal message to the anaesthetist. It's okay. You don't have to chat. I just want to rest in my own being, and it's okay. So I closed my eyes and just rested in my own being. A couple of moments later, I opened my eyes, and there was the anaesthetist and the anaesthetist's assistant, and I said to him, "When are you going to give me the anesthetic?" And he said, "Not only have I given you the anesthetic, you've had your operation." I didn't believe him. I thought he was joking with me, and then I put my hand up. Oh, yes, it had happened. Nothing had taken place. Nothing had happened. As far as I was concerned, nothing had happened. In the waking state, nothing had happened. But there had been a crack in the waking state, into which, in another dimension, not in the waking state, in another state, an activity had been performed, but it didn't register in the waking state. It didn't register in the dimension of the waking state. It only registered, if you go through the crack, it registered in that state. Something happened in that state. But from the perspective of the waking state, whatever happened in that state, it did not register. My experience was one of continuity of awareness. No break in it, just continuity of awareness. Nothing happened in the waking state. So, in this analogy, the waking state is consciousness. And the state I was in when I had the operation would be the equivalent of the waking state. So whatever is happening in this waking state is, from the point of view of consciousness, like a crack in consciousness, a hairline crack in consciousness. You go through that crack, and all of this takes place in time and space. But from consciousness's point of view, the time and space in which all of this takes place doesn't exist. It takes a moment. It doesn't even take a moment. It takes less than a moment, because there are no moments. There is no time and space. So from consciousness's point of view, you are right, nothing ever happens. From a very absolute point of view. So what you felt this morning was a kind of intuition about this, although it is almost impossible to speak about it, because we cannot at the same time deny the fact that there is something, not nothing. So you're right. The teaching that everything is the activity of consciousness is the highest teaching that we can speak of. Beyond that, in a realm which we simply cannot go with the mind, we could say nothing ever happens.
Yeah.
It's in Sanskrit. It's called Ajatavada, the point of view that there is no world, there is no appearance of the world, nothing ever happens. But don't try to reconcile that point of view with the point of view that everything we experience is the activity of consciousness. They are both true on the level on which they are spoken.
Sure. Yeah.
The view that everything that exists is the activity of consciousness is already a profound challenge to our normal assumptions.
Sure.
The understanding that nothing ever happens is even more of a challenge, and is really something we can't speak of.
No,
so,
but it's certainly something that can obviously be lived. I mean, that's what you're teaching, right?
Well, at a practical level, I would recommend living with the understanding that there is just consciousness and its activity. Because there is something taking place, that there is. So how are we to interpret this something that is taking place in line with the consciousness-only model? We interpret it as the activity of consciousness.